Welcome to our panel. We're here to talk with Candace Fleming, Alan Gratz, Tate, and Jennifer Nielsen. They are writers of historical nonfiction. Sorry about that, starting my video. They're writers of historical nonfiction as well as historical fiction. So we're excited to be able to talk with them today. We're going to start with introductions. Each will take a few minutes to introduce themselves. We're going to start with Jen Nielsen first, then Alan Gratz, Candace Fleming, and then Tate. So Jennifer, if you'll start and give us a little intro.
Oh, fantastic. First of all, thank you everyone for being here. I love doing these conferences. It's always a little special when it's a little closer to home. So I'm very happy to be here with all of you. And thanks to the organizers for the invitation and for making this happen. I just released a new historical novel like 3 days ago. So the ink isn't even totally dry. This is Rescue. This is the story of a girl in Nazi-occupied France who receives a secret coded message from her father. And she needs to be able to decipher this in order to help rescue him from a German prisoner of war camp. I know there's a lot of World War II stories out there. This one's very near and dear to my heart because it gets into some things that I think kids are really fascinated by, that I'm fascinated by, about secret codes, about spies, the spy gear that they had. Winston Churchill called his spy organization the League of Ungentlemanly Behavior. They were the Mission Impossible team of their time. And so to get to bring in information about them and how they might operate a secret mission was just really a lot of fun. Writing historicals is a lot of fun. So that's a little bit about me. I'm going to pass it on to the next.
So hey there, I am Alan Gratz. I am the author of 17 books so far for young readers. And I was born and raised in Knoxville, Tennessee, and now live in Asheville, North Carolina. And this is my full-time job, writing books right here from my office. My latest book is Ground Zero. Ground Zero is a story of 9/11. If you were with me in the first session, you heard all about it. If not, it is briefly the story of two different kids. The first is Brandon. He's 9 years old, and he is trapped in the North Tower of the World Trade Center on the morning of September 11, 2001, and has to try and find a way to survive. The second story is from the point of view of an 11-year-old girl named Reshmina, who is Afghan, and she is going through her own version of 9/11 as her village in Afghanistan becomes a battleground between the United States and the Taliban, who are still at war 20 years after 9/11. Because the war in Afghanistan continues. That's me and my new book. I'm thrilled to be here this morning with you guys. I wish I could be there live and in person in Utah with you guys, maybe soon, hopefully. In the meantime, I will pass things along. I think Candace is up next.
Hi, I'm Candace Fleming. You can call me Candy. I am so excited to be here. Welcome to my office in Chicago. I really wish I was there in Utah. It's a state I love so very much, and I've been so often. So I'm sure I have a lot of friends out in the that are participants today. I've been writing children's books, everything from preschool to young adult, everything from fiction to nonfiction. I've been doing this for almost unbelievably 30 decades now. So the secret is, of course, that I started writing children's books when I was 12. I've got 52 books, I think, now that you can find somewhere at the library. I have 3 books coming in 2021. Unfortunately, none of them can I show you because I don't have a physical copy. But the books that came out in 2020, my new books, the first one is a biography. It's historical nonfiction. It's for young adults, called The Rise and Fall of Charles Lindbergh. And I'm so ecstatic to say that this actually won this year's YALSA Excellence in Nonfiction Award. I also have another piece of nonfiction that came out this year called Honeybee. You would think that these two books have absolutely nothing to do with each other, but in fact, they have one commonality. They're both about flyers. Honeybee, of course, is a picture book. It's nonfiction. It's about honeybees. It actually follows the one life of one individual bee. And again, I'm ecstatic to say that this book actually won the Cybert Medal from American Library Association this year for the best nonfiction or best informational book. I'm looking forward to spending some time with you guys today and talking about the thing that I love most, which is writing history, writing nonfiction. So thank you.
Don, you're
Don, you're muted.
Muted? Okay, all right. My name is Don Tate, and I'm coming to you today from snowy Austin, Texas, as you probably have heard in the news. Actually, however, today is a very nice day. It's like 70 degrees here. I am primarily an illustrator. I've illustrated more than 80 trade and educational books for kids throughout my 30-plus-year career. I focused mainly on illustrating biographies of little-known historical figures like Ethel Manley, Lonnie Johnson, John Roy Lynch, and many, many others. I started writing in 2010 or so. My first authored book was called It Just Happened When Bill Traylor Started to Draw, and it's the story of a little known but important outsider artist who was once enslaved. I am now the author and illustrator. I'm now an author illustrator, and I'm writing and illustrating my works. My current book is called William Steele and His Freedom Stories, the Father of the Underground Railroad. And it's the story of an unheralded Black abolitionist who helped hundreds of enslaved people escape north on the Underground Railroad system. And another book that I recently illustrated and right behind me called Swish. It's kind of a long title, so I got you to turn around and look at it. Swish, the slam dunking, alley-ooping, high-flying Harlem Globetrotters, which is the story of the original Harlem Globetrotters, which was a basketball team that started back in the 1920s. I'm so honored to be with you all here this morning, and I look forward to our conversation.
Thank you. Thank you all so much. I'm so excited to have you here. Our first question, and we'll start with Alan with this and then go through everybody, Jen, Candace, Dawn, we'll take a turn. How did you pick your genre as far as like, how did you decide between that you wanted to do historical fiction or nonfiction? Hopefully
Sure. So, yeah, for me, I have not written historical nonfiction. I'm thinking about it, but I'm in awe of the people on this panel who've done that. Candy's book about Lindbergh. I can't wait to read that. I love reading historical nonfiction, and I use it extensively when I write my historical fiction, but I'm in awe of people who do it because it just seems like a monumental task to me. So I've never written historical nonfiction. For me, the reason that I choose fiction over nonfiction is I like the freedom to be able to take the real things that happened in a historical time period or a particular event and rearrange those to create a story out of it that may not have been exactly what happened, but give me a little bit more freedom to make a good beginning and a middle and an end, because often real historical events don't have nice, tidy, they don't tie up with a nice tight bow at the end. But that allows me to drop a fictional character in the middle of the real history that's going on and have them have a story that has a beginning, middle, and end with the history as the backdrop. So I love the puzzle aspect of taking the historical event and fitting it into a story, but then I love the freedom of having a fictional character who then can run around and have the main story happen to them. But boy, it would be an interesting challenge, I know, to turn a real person, a real event into a story itself that's totally nonfiction. And I can't wait to hear from Candy to hear how she does that. So I will pass the baton on to you, Candy.
Oh, thanks. You know what? I decided, I was listening to Alan and I thought I'm going to tell a little story about how I decided to write a piece of fiction as opposed to historical fiction as opposed to nonfiction. A few years ago, I was at this historical society, this little historical society in northern Indiana on the shores of Lake Michigan. And I found in their little historical society, when I was looking through their photographs, I found this ancient pamphlet that had been published back in the 1940s. And it told this very brief outline, this story about a man named Loudner Phillips, who had perfected a submarine so well in 1850 that it actually had a steam boiler that it ran on under the water, and it actually had an air filtration system so that people could breathe underwater. And additionally, it had a chandelier, I'm not kidding, and a red velvet carpet. That was fascinating enough. But then I found this sentence in that pamphlet where they actually said that he had taken his family, his wife, his 3 children, and their French bulldog on a ride Sunday afternoon under Lake Michigan. Now, right away, I'm thinking this is the subject of my next piece of nonfiction. So I hurry upstairs. They give me, the ladies at the Historical Society give me a very thin file with just a couple of old newspaper clippings about Phillips. Not enough. I'm thinking nonfiction, right? So then I go to the county clerk, I think New South, well, I do a short, real quick online search. Nothing has been written about him. So I have to get creative. So now I'm going to the county clerk's office and I'm looking at state taxes, and I'm looking at the 1850 US Census. I thought, I went to the National Archives and looked for patents because he'd been an inventor. So surely he had applied for some patents. I wrote to the Navy because surely he contacted the Navy about this invention. And I did end up finding some archival photographs of his submarine. I found some patents that he actually hand drew, so I knew what the thing actually looked like. I've discovered his name, his kids' ages, his kids' names, but here's the rub. Not one of those sources actually provided any clues to what Phillips' thoughts or feelings were. There were no hints about his relationship with his wife, no hints about his relationship with his children. And so my idea for a nonfiction book, and no pun here is intended, but it was sunk, right? And good history, that is the good history that actually connects with readers, requires a human viewpoint. And I couldn't walk around in Phillips's shoes at all. Do I abandon that project then? No, because I felt that to do so would sort of turn my back on that story. And so I decided to tell a different one, right? Part his and part mine. So I used those fragments of history that I did know, and I used my imagination for the rest of it. And that is always my determining factor when I decide if it's a fiction book or a nonfiction. Do I have a human connection? Can I walk around in their shoes? If I can't, then it's historical fiction.
Tina, you are muted.
So sorry, we're all learning. Thank you, Candy. Jennifer, your turn.
Okay, I will go. I think that nonfiction and fiction are both really valuable tools within a classroom, and I think they're most valuable when they're paired together. If you can find two that supplement each other, it's so great, because what happens when we create fiction is we create that emotional bond between the reader and the story, and they become emotionally connected to that character who is involved in whatever struggle is the topic of the story. And once they are bonded to that character, they just develop this incredible appetite to see more. And I know you've seen it in the libraries and in the classrooms. You've seen these kids who finish a historical novel and then they say, what else do you have about this time period? And that's why that nonfiction is so valuable, because it provides perspectives that I cannot within a fictional world. And so as much as we can use these as tools together, all the better.
Awesome, thank you. All right, Don, you're up.
My answer is just real simple. I've just never really had much of an interest in fiction. I'm not a fiction person. My wife loves fiction. She goes through, I can't tell you how many books a month, fiction books a month. And occasionally I will read a fiction book and I'm like, why do I want to fill my head with all these stories that's made up out of an author's head when there's all of these wonderful true stories, true compelling stories that actually happen. So I just never had an interest in fiction. When I was a kid, I wasn't much of a reader. And my favorite book was the Family Illustrated Medical Encyclopedia that was filled with bloody stomach ulcers and pussy toe sores. But I think that the reason why I loved that book was because it was real stuff. I also remember sometimes during the summers, I worked a summer job where I had to I cleaned out the library, and I would go in there and I would read books like the Guinness Book of World Records. I've just always loved that, knowing that what I read could actually happen. And I think that because I read nonfiction as a kid, that put me on a path to telling nonfiction stories as an adult. That's a very simple answer.
I love that. Okay, Dawn, stay on. I want to ask you and everybody, but I'm going to have you start to share with us your research process. But I'm assuming that when you're doing illustrating, that it might be a little bit different. So I'd like to hear how you as an illustrator go through the research process.
Well, I'll start off on the writing side of it. When I write a story, I have to research every aspect of a character's life. I need to know the timeline. I need to know the setting. I need to know all of the events that I can find in that person's life. And then I need to figure out how to fit all of those things into the arc of the story. As the illustrator, I'm more interested in what things looked like. So I'm reaching out to librarians, asking them to provide me, if they can provide me with materials that I can read to learn what the world in which a character looked like. For instance, with William Steele and his Freedom Stories, the father of the Underground Railroad, this story took place during the mid-1800s in Philadelphia, which was a free state. And so my question all along was, what would that have looked like? You have freedom-seeking people coming in from out of the South into a city, seeking out the Anti-Slavery Society office. What would that have looked like? So I need to find, and oftentimes, I feel like, I have to make an educated guess on some of these answers. I don't know what William Steele's Anti-Slavery Society office exactly looked like. I don't know exactly what he wore on a particular day. I don't know what he had on his plate while he was eating his breakfast. So, but I can do the research, and I actually did make a research trip to Philadelphia, and I actually visited an office where William Steele once worked, and I took photographs, and I sketched, and I used those sketches and those photographs to reimagine what his world would have looked like.
Awesome, thank you. I have a question in our Q&A, and it goes right along with this, so I want to ask it. As librarians who also teach research, how do you do, or what is your go-to source? So do you have a go-to source? So as you guys, the rest of you answer this, think about if you have a go-to source. I'm always interested in sending kids to the real content of the historical fiction books. And he says he's the type who reads the footnotes.
My go-to source is always librarians. That's like the librarians are like the smartest people that I know. So the first thing that I do, like for instance, I started writing a book this time last year. The first person that I reached out to was a librarian friend with me who hooked me up with other librarian friends, and I found all my answers through librarians.
Awesome, thank you. How about, do we have somebody who wants to go next? Raise your hand. Anybody? Okay.
Yeah, all right. So I just did type an answer into the Q&A, but I'm sure other authors will have their input. All right, for me, when I am researching, I learned this really valuable lesson when I was doing the book Resistance, which is based on the true story of the Jewish teenagers who fought back during the Holocaust. And I talked to somebody from Yad Vashem then who said something that's forever going to stay with me. She said, there are people in this world who deny the Holocaust ever happened. And so if we get one little fact incorrect, then that denier can say, well, she made this up. Maybe it's all made up. And it really impressed upon me the importance of getting the research correct. And so some of what I do, I'm going to just flip around to right here and right there on my screen if you can see it. I use maps always in historical, but I use it from the time period because maps change over time. That's important to me. I use as much as I can get to like original things. This is a rescue map, which the spies would have used during World War II, made of silk because it doesn't rustle the same way paper does. And so I use originals because to touch it, to have it tangible is very, very valuable. I talk about going as close to the original sources as I can. I'm doing a World War I novel right now. This is the history of the World War, but here's the great thing. This was published the year the war ended. So this isn't a historical novel, this is a contemporary novel. This would have been written without them even knowing how the war is going to turn out. It's written in its time. And the other thing, I told you I use maps, but I want to explain just how important it is for me to get the details. When doing Resistance, this is a Nazi aerial map of the Warsaw Ghetto. I got it down to the place where I am tracing the sewer lines in the Warsaw Ghetto of where you could enter a sewer line and where that sewer line would take you. And so even though I'm writing within a fictional context, I understand that kids who read it will read it and consider it fact. So if I put something in there as fact, that is what happened.
Awesome, thank you. Alan, you want to tell us about your research process?
Sure. A lot of great stuff has already been said, and I won't duplicate that. I will say that for me, there isn't one great go-to source. I'm always looking for that one golden source, that one thing that I'm going to read and be like, bam, this is the thing that gets me the closest to the time and place and the people that I'm writing about. In particular, their thoughts and feelings and how they experienced that moment. But I will add too that I start big. If I'm writing something about World War II, I want to understand where I am in World War II right then, where the world was, and then I'm going to start narrowing my focus in with my research piece at a time. So if I'm writing something about the Battle of Okinawa, I start with where we were in the war at that moment, where the world was in the war at that moment, then where the Pacific theater was. I also want to know where the European theater was and how that might have played a part on it. But so I'd start with the large stuff, and then I focus in. So the first things I'm reading are larger histories of a time and a place. And by the end, I'm hoping to be reading firsthand accounts of people's experiences in that time and that's very specific time and place that I'm writing about. I've heard some people call this like a snowflake method, where the outside edges, it's like a snowflake with all the branching pieces to it, and you want to keep getting closer and closer and closer into that center, and that center is where your book lives. But you need to know all the other pieces of it to be able to put it into context. So I'm sure I, like everybody else on this panel, does way more research than you're ever going to see in that book. But it's important for us to know everything about a time and a place as much as possible, so that we know the context in which our single story is happening.
Thank you. Candy, do you have anything to add?
Yeah, I love that. I do that big, that I never thought of it as snowflake. That's why I was nodding and grinning, and I think I wrote it down. My research, I can tell you my 4 paths, but my research process is really organic. So I start in a really big place. I know that I'm going to write generally about Charles Lindbergh, but I don't really know where I'm going to go with that. I think I know him, but I don't really. And so I ask a lot of questions, and I ask a lot of personal questions, and I write those questions down, and I start with questions seriously, like what was his favorite color? What was his favorite food? Did he believe in God? What did he carry in his pocket? Did he sleep on his back? Who was his first kiss? These are questions that I almost always start with. And the reason I am is because even though I am writing nonfiction, I am not a fact teller. I am a storyteller. And so my nonfiction, my biggest goal is to have that emotional bond, the same one thing that Jennifer was talking about with her fiction. That is exactly what my goal is when I write nonfiction. And so to do that, I have to discover everything, sort of leave no rock on not, what am I trying to say? I'm going to look under every rock. And so I am, like I said, I'm really organic. So sometimes I don't even expect to find, I have no idea that I'm going to find, oh, well, this letter that sets me off on a path that I never even expected. And that's where usually the story, eventually the material will tell me the story that I'm going to write and how that story is going to be written. My 4 paths, I have 4 general paths. I always start with primary sources. I prefer primary sources over anything else because that allows me to make my own decisions about who that person actually was based on their writings or what their neighbors said about them or what they put in their diary, what newspapers of the time say. I always make sure that even though I'm looking at primary sources, I know that doesn't mean they're actually the accurate source. I make sure that I understand who that perspective it's being written from. If it's a male perspective, if it's a white perspective, who's writing that primary source at the time. And so it's all primary, almost all my research is primary source material. I talk to experts, so I find those people that have who know that subject more than anybody else. I talk to them, I pepper them with questions. They either become my very best friend or they see an email from me and they probably go, oh my gosh, here's that woman again. I travel. I always go everywhere if I can. I have a book coming out about Egypt next fall, and I actually did go to Egypt and spent quite a bit of time there. So I always go to the places that the people visit, they worked, because I really believe that houses hold memories and landscapes speak. And I discover so much about those people when I can stand in those spots. And then secondary sources. What did other people write? What have other people written about this event? But I do that very, very late because I don't want those other writers on that topic to taint how I feel about the topic. I have to figure it out on my own, which I think is why, at least I hope, is why my books have a different way into those persons' lives than has been done before. So.
Very interesting. I like how you talked about that you travel to places that you go. That was kind of like almost like my next question. So for everybody, how often do you travel to the places that are in your books? Anybody who would like to answer that?
So
I'm traveling too much right now, which is why the current book I'm working on is a Chicago story. So it's literally around the corner. Thank goodness, right? But I always travel. So I follow those, and my poor family has seriously, when I worked on the book about the Lincolns, my poor family went to every Lincoln site. I mean, every Lincoln site, things they didn't even know were Lincoln sites, but I did. We had to stop, my poor sons, and they still love me. But I always go. And the reason I always go, and like I said, Egypt, I spent 3 weeks in Egypt. When I did the Romanovs, I went to Russia. And it really changes things for me in ways that I would never have expected. When I was working on the family Romanov, I went to Tsarskoye Selo, which is this imperial park that the Russian family, the Tsar and his wife had, the Russian rulers had for centuries. Nicholas and Alexandra moved there to get away from everybody, to get away from things, to be alone with their family. From all the primary source material I had read before I went, it made it sound like they'd picked this little place in the middle of the park and they saw no one, right? They wanted to escape from the people. They wanted to escape from their responsibilities. They wanted to escape and be alone. When I got to Sarcosela, what I realized was that they were not alone. They had not escaped from their people. They had picked this the little palace. Yes, it was only 150 rooms. But the rooms that they picked along the side actually looked over a fence, a wrought iron fence. And on the other side of the fence was the actual village. So they would have seen the Russian people that they were trying not to see. They would have seen them every single day. And not only that, it's 1900. So they would have heard them. They would have heard the babies crying. They would have heard their arguments. They would have heard their singing. They would have smelled their food cooking. And I remember standing there and realizing, holding onto that fence actually, and realizing that this was not a physical isolation, which I had thought it was, but it was really a psychological isolation. And just that moment in travel changed my entire viewpoint of the book. So I realized at that moment that I had to tell other stories about Russian peasants and soldiers and revolutionaries. And I ended up actually calling those parts of the book Beyond the Palace Gates, because I had actually stood beyond the palace gates. So travel, absolutely.
Yeah, I typically like to do a research trip. There's typically not a research budget. And I probably shouldn't say typically, there's never a research budget, but I think that it's important to go and walk the land where your subject, once lived. Two research trips that I had a lot of fun with was with the William Steele book. One, I went to Philadelphia, visited the Philadelphia Historical Society, and I discovered there that they had some of William Steele's his actual Journal C, which is where he documented the night that Harriet Tubman passed through his line of the Underground Railroad system. And I was actually able to hold that in my hands. And I became so struck by that image that it became the end papers you can see that for the book. And you can see where Harriet Tubman passed through his line of the Underground Railroad on December 29th, 1854. I also made a trip to the Free Library of Philadelphia, where I was able to hold in my hands an actual first edition copy of William Steele's Underground Railroad Records. And it is the most beautiful book that I've ever held. It's like emerald green, it's embossed, it's gold stamped. Had no idea that kind of technology and books even existed in the 1800s, but beautiful book. And another research trip that I think was probably the most fun that I ever had, and it's kind of a funny thing, was with my book, Strong as Sandow, How Eugene Sandow Became the Strongest Man on Earth. As I researched this book, I kept coming across all of this information at this wonderful place called the Stark Center for Physical Culture. They had Eugene Sandow bust there. They had a Eugene Sandow, some of his magazine articles that he wrote. He had the place had Eugene Sandow books. And I kept trying to figure out, where is this wonderful Stark Center? So I wrote the book, I sold the book, I had the book edited. And then right before it was to go to print, I discovered that the Stark Center is right here in Austin, Texas, at the top of the University of Texas Tower. So I did my research trip. I went and I spent 3 days there just going through all of these, Eugene Sandow archives. And then I went back to the drawing board and rewrote much of the story, because I had all of this actual stuff that I could now work into the story. And so, yeah, I think that research trips are very important, and they also make for just great social networking, and talking about when I visit elementary schools later, telling the students about my experiences with learning about the subject that I'm writing about.
Excellent. Thank you for sharing that. Jen, do you have anything that you would like to add?
Just very briefly, resistance I discovered on a research trip in Krakow, Poland, standing in a Jewish cemetery where the gravestones were so tightly packed in. It's the way that books are lined up on the shelves of your library, as tight as you can get them. And there I discovered a Jewish grave marker that caught my attention, of the Goldberg family. And it really bothered me. Two things about it bothered me as I studied it. The first was that as I looked down, there's dad and mom, both who died in 1944, the two younger sons who died in 1944, the daughter Sala, who died in 1944, and there is the oldest son, Rafal, who died in 1986. And I thought, why him? Why him when the rest of his family, because it probably wasn't only the same year they died, probably the same day, probably within minutes of each other, that this family was killed by the Nazis, all of them but Rafal. And then I looked below his name and there was another name, and that bothered me even more. The name was Eugenis Kazmierzyk. Well, that's a Christian Polish name. And I thought, what is a Christian name doing on a Jewish grave marker in a Jewish cemetery? That absolutely should not be there. And I'm the type of person when I notice things like this and it bothers me, I've got to get the answers to the questions. And so of course the research began, and I realized, I figured out Rafal Goldberg. When the Nazis invaded, he was able to obtain false identification under the name of Eugenis Kazmierzyk. And that false identification and his ability to convince the Nazis that he was someone he is not was the only reason he survived when the rest of his family did not. And once I had that, I was already down the road to writing the rest of that novel.
That's awesome. I really like, it seems so interesting to me how you guys, your research or these trips help your research. I want to ask you, I have a question here that came through. Oh, as long as it doesn't move. A Night Divided, which I loved as well so much. What gave you the idea to write about that time in history?
All right, thank you. I did answer it on Q&A, but I'll explain it just a little bit. There's a family friend of ours, Ilona, who was born into East Germany. And when she was 5 years old, things were bad enough that they made the decision to leave. This was shortly before the wall, but mom and dad were going to leave in the countryside. The border wasn't as well marked or guarded, but Ilona's 5. And how are they going to take a 5-year-old girl like running through the countryside? What if they're being chased or it's bad weather? They didn't know. So Ilona needed a different situation. Her grandparents came in from the West on train. They're going to return with her on the train, but not on the seat beside them because she has no papers. So at age 5, Ilona was drugged, put to sleep, and hidden in the baggage car of the train beneath a pile of hay. Her grandparents knew full well if that car would be stopped and searched at the border. If Ilona even rolled over in her sleep, she would be sent back to East Germany alone, and her grandparents would be shot on sight or arrested. When I heard the story, I knew I wanted to write about the people of East Germany.
That's amazing. Love that story. Thank you. Alan, do you have anything you would like to share about your research process?
So it's funny that I go last here about research trips because I have not been on a single research trip for any book that I have written. I'm super jealous of all the other people on the panel who talk about going to the places that they have written about. I've never been able to do it. As a matter of fact, for me, it's worked the opposite way. What's happened is I've written about a place and a time, and then I've ended up getting to visit that place after the fact and going there and exploring the places that I wrote about. Most notably for me, my very first book was historical fiction. It's Samurai Shortstop, and it's about Japanese kids in the 1890s playing baseball and blending it with their Bushido lessons, their way of the warrior lessons from samurai practice. And I wrote that book, and then it was, I think, a year or two later that a school in Japan contacted me, an international school, and said, "We love Samurai Shortstop. We use it in the classroom. We'd like to invite you to be a writer in residence at our school for 6 weeks. Do you want to come over?" And I was like, yes. So I spent 6 weeks at the American school in Japan, in Tokyo, and got to go and walk to the places that I had written about for the first time. So it's always worked for me the opposite way. I end up going to places only after I've written about them. And now my wife is like, "Please write a book about Australia. Please write a book about Iceland," places she wants to go to, because then we end up getting a trip out of it. But no, I've unfortunately never had the time or means to go to a place that I'm writing about. I'm super jealous of everybody else who's been able to do it.
Thank you. We are getting low on our time, but I have another question. Candy, this one's actually for you, and maybe for Dawn too, do you feel like your research process is different for your novels or for your larger books compared to your picture books? Like, how do you edit down all of that information? So like I was looking behind you, like you have Giant Squid, which I love, is a great book. But those kind of things. So when you're doing a picture book, how do you do your research for that?
Yeah, eventually it becomes, at first, this is what I said when I was saying about research sort of being organic for me. I discovered that I want to write about something, usually because not usually, always because I'm super curious. Somebody, who was it that was saying, I think that was Jennifer, that said, all of a sudden I had to know more. Right. I think all of us have that weird gene, right? I always say the question that sets me off in some nonfiction project is that one where I go, huh? What? Right? It's that what? And so you're off, right? And so I never know really what I'm going to do with that particular subject until I start to do the research. So even when I was off, say like on Giant Squid, I mean, this is a weird thing that people would be obsessed about, but this is how it works for me. And what I discovered about Giant Squid as I did my research was, and this naturally led then to the discovery that it was a picture book and not a big piece of nonfiction, was simply the fact that I would get I had this huge book from a guy named Richard Ellis, who's like the #1 giant squid expert in the world. And it's fully 300 pages, but only 12 pages have facts about giant squid, because we don't have any facts. We have just very little. We know more about the surface of the moon than we know about giant squid. I think is incredible. We know more about dinosaurs than we know about giant squid. And yet scientists estimate that there are hundreds of thousands of creatures that can be the size of a school bus swimming in our oceans. There they are, and we don't know anything about them. And when I realized that, and it took me a while to do the research, when I realized that this was going to be a book about mystery and what we don't know about our planet. And it naturally then seemed to me that it was a picture book, rather than a giant piece of nonfiction. And of course, the research process then becomes different. I know that I have, I always think 32 pages, although Don can speak to the reason why suddenly we're adding pages to that. And I know Giant Squid and Honeybee are both longer than that. But initially when I write, I always think I have 32 pages. And that means it's going to be short. It has to be really distilled information. A book like Charles Lindbergh, which is 300 pages and is unbelievably detailed, becomes a 4-year research project for me, which is why I read a lot of preschool stuff in between, right? Not a lot of fiction. So the material really does determine what I end up doing with it. Yeah, thanks.
Sorry, I was muted. Dawn, you're going to be our last. I have a question. How do you use your illustrations to develop the characters in your books?
I pretty much let the story, because I'm not an illustrator who has a trademark illustration style. I would get bored if I get up every day and paint in oils, or I would, if I just, got up every day and just did my stuff in Scratchboard. I like to experiment with different illustration media. And so I let the tone of the story dictate the direction that I'll take the visuals. My books tend to be more serious. So my books oftentimes deal with the topic of slavery or civil rights or Reconstruction. And so I tend to illustrate those books using more of a, I don't know, whimsical is maybe not a good word because those aren't whimsical subject matters, but I tend to just kind of tone down this, the style of the illustrations, so that I don't scare my young readers. For instance, in the book, The Amazing Age of John Roy Lynch, there's a scene in the book where there is almost a lynching. There's a scene where there is a church burning by hooded Klansmen. And I kind of felt like if I would have illustrated that book in a more realistic, serious style, then that would have changed the whole tone of those scenes. So I try to kind of soften the subject matter, and it's been kind of a challenge in determining the style. When I first got into publishing, I was told by a lot of editors that you can't illustrate African Americans in cartoon character styles. And that's because for so many years, African Americans had been portrayed as, you know, cartoons and characters and monkeys and that sort of thing. But when I visited bookstores, and you know, I kind of felt like all of the African American books looked the same. The white books, the books about trucks and cars and bugs and bees, they had all these different illustration styles, and I just kind of felt like I wanted to be able to have that for books, you know, for African American kids as well. So for a while, I had to experiment and try different things, and I've even had people question me. For instance, with my poet. The Remarkable Story of George Moses Horton, which is probably the book that has won the most awards. And I remember one time a librarian asked me, well, you know, she said, I love the book, but why would you portray him as a cartoon? And I said, well, because my very serious story about slavery has to compete with The Dragons Love Tacos. And so what I want to do is create illustrations that are engaging, that draw my readers in, and then I give them a history lesson.
Thank you so much. I love that. I love your books. Even though I'm a middle school librarian, I still have a bunch of picture books, and I'm getting William Still. That's next on my list.
You.
Thank you so much. Thank you, everyone. Our time is up. This has been great. Appreciate you all so much. We all love you so much. All of you have such great ideas and books, and we look forward to all that you come out with next. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Tina.
Thank you, Tina.
Thank you.
Thanks, Tina.
Honored to be
Thanks
here.
for everybody being here.
It was fun
Yes.
being with y'all.
Great group of authors. Great to see you all. Yep.